Welcome to The Explainer. Ever picked up a book from the early 20th century and thought, wow, this is weird? Fragmented, chaotic, all up in the characters' heads. Well, that was modernism. And today, we are breaking down this absolutely revolutionary movement. And hey, if you're a UGC Net or JRF aspirant, you're going to want to stick around. This is the deep dive you've been waiting for. All right, so here's our game plan for today. First, we're going to look at what was happening in the world that even caused modernism. Then, we'll see exactly how it smashed the old Victorian way of doing things. We'll dive into the game-changing techniques they used in novels and poetry, give you a power-packed toolkit for your exam, and then wrap it all up by asking why any of this still matters today.
So, how does an entire way of making art just break? Well, to really get modernism, you have to look at the world that basically tore up the old rulebook. And that forces us to ask a really basic but crucial question.
I mean, why couldn't writers just keep on writing the way they always had? The simple answer is this. The world itself had broken into a million pieces, and the old ways of telling stories just couldn't make sense of the new reality. Just try to picture the 19th century, the Victorian era, right? It kind of felt like a big, sturdy house built on solid ground. There was this shared belief in progress, in things getting better, in a society that was stable and a universe that was, understandable. And the literature of the time totally reflected that. And then the 20th century came crashing in, and it brought with it these huge shocks that just completely dismantled that stable world, leaving behind this deep sense of crisis and a feeling of being totally alone and alienated. World War I was the absolute bombshell. It was a kind of slaughter nobody had ever seen before, and it just destroyed that whole myth of progress. But the ground was already shaking, You have thinkers like Freud telling us our minds were these chaotic, irrational places. You had Nietzsche declaring that God was dead, which pulled the rug out from under the whole idea of moral certainty. So how could a neat, orderly, traditional novel even begin to capture this new, fragmented reality? The answer is it couldn't. The old tools were broken. So with the old world in ruins, artists had to invent a whole new way to see. This new reality demanded a totally new kind of art. And the novel became the main laboratory for this grand experiment. And this chart here, it just lays out the shift so perfectly. Victorian novels were all about the outside world, society, class, and clear moral lessons told to you by a narrator who knew everything. But the modernists, they turned the camera completely inward. They focused on the individual mind, on subjective truth. And that all-knowing narrator? Gone. Virginia Woolf said it best. She argued life wasn't a neat, orderly series of gig lamps, but a luminous halo, a messy, beautiful internal glow of consciousness. And this obsession with the inner world, with that luminous halo, it led directly to probably the single most important innovation in modernist fiction. The solution they came up with was called the stream of consciousness. They actually borrowed the term from a psychologist, William James, and their goal was incredibly ambitious. They wanted to record the mind as it's happening. They wanted to capture reality before we edit it and clean it up into a nice, neat story. The raw, jumbled, associative flow of thoughts and memories that's actually going on in our heads all the time. Okay, so these are the key players you absolutely have to know. Of course, you've got James Joyce and Virginia Woolf, the superstars. But, and this is a major pro tip for your exam, you have to remember it was actually Dorothy Richardson who pioneered the technique in her massive novel series, Pilgrimage. And here's another little nugget for you. The critic Mason Clay was the first person to actually use the term stream of consciousness to describe Richardson's writing way back in 1918. But this obsession with smashing the old forms and finding new ways to see reality, it wasn't just happening in novels. Nope. Poetry was going through its own radical reinvention. It was a complete demolition and rebuilding project, right from the ground up. Make it new. These three little words from the poet Ezra became the powerful, unforgettable rallying cry for all of modernist poetry. It was basically a command to stop writing that flowery, vague, emotional stuff from the Victorian era. So the first organized movement to answer that call was Imagism. Led by Pound, the Imagists thought a poem should be like a sculpture, precise, clear, with every single extra bit chipped away. They wanted poetry that was, in their own words, hard and dry. It was all about the direct presentation of an image and nothing else. Which brings us to T.S. Eliot's huge idea, the objective correlative. It sounds complicated, but it's not. Eliot argued that a poet shouldn't just write, "I'm sad,"
That's lazy. Instead, the poet's job is to create a formula out in the world, a set of objects, a specific situation that, when you read about it, will automatically create that feeling of sadness in you. It's not about the poet's personality, it's all about the craft.
Okay, let's switch gears. This next section is designed specifically to help you crush that exam. We're going to lock in some of the most important, high-yield facts and dates that you absolutely need to have in your back pocket. This timeline is absolutely crucial. Seriously, the NET exam loves asking you to put works in chronological order, so you have to know these dates. Notice 1915 for Richardson's groundbreaking novel. And of course, 1922. You have to remember 1922. It's the Annus Mirabilis, the miracle year of modernism, when both The Wasteland and Ulysses came out. Huge. And please, please, please do not forget the little magazines. This is such a high-frequency topic on the exam. Why? Because these journals were the intellectual battlegrounds where all these modernist ideas were being hammered out. The Egoist was crucial, Poetry magazine launched major careers, and the Criterion, which was edited by Eliot himself, was basically the Bible of high modernism.
So after all of this, all this breaking of rules, all this radical experimentation, where did it leave us? What is the big takeaway from the whole modernist project?
The real legacy of modernism is that it completely changed the reader's job. In a world where there was no single stable meaning anymore, the author wasn't just going to hand you a nice, neat story with a moral at the end. Nope. From now on, you, the reader, had to become an active participant. You had to become a detective, piecing together the meaning from the heap of broken images the author gave you.
And that brings us to one last kind of provocative thought. I want you to think about your own life. Scrolling through fragmented social media feeds, trying to make sense of a dozen different news sources, we're constantly piecing together narratives from conflicting information, right? The modernists were the first to really diagnose this feeling. So the real question isn't just about literary history. It's about us. In our chaotic, information-saturated world, are we all modernists now?